name is Heidi Bostic, and I'm chair of the department, which is soon to be renamed Modern Languages and Cultures here at Baylor University. Anthony Rudd doesn't realize this, but I'm actually a fan of his work. I work a little bit in narrative identity, and he's written a wonderful article called In Defense of Narrative, as well as his recent book on Kierkegaard, the self and narrative. He's one of those, sorry, I'll have to say it, rare philosophers who can write very wonderfully well for non-philosophers to actually be able to understand, so bravo. Let me just briefly introduce him and our respondent, and then we'll let him get started. Anthony Rudd is visiting associate professor of philosophy at St. Olaf College. I came this close to going to St. Olaf, but I'll tell you about it later. His interests include epistemology, philosophy of mind, ethics, Kierkegaard, of course, Wittgenstein, and Heidegger. He's published articles in such journals as, take a deep breath and list these, the Philosophical Quarterly, Philosophical Studies, Metaphilosophy, the Journal of Consciousness Studies, the British Journal for History of Philosophy, Inquiry, European Journal of Philosophy, and Kierkegaardiana. He's the author of 3 books, Kierkegaard and the Limits of the Ethical, Expressing the World, Skepticism, Wittgenstein, and Heidegger, and most recently, as I mentioned, his 2012 book, Self, Value, and Narrative, a Kierkegaardian approach. And his talk today will be entitled Kierkegaard's Christian Platonism. He'll be followed by a respondent by our own Baylor's own Daniel Mars, who is a PhD candidate and teaching fellow in the religion department. Would you join me in welcoming Dr. Anthony Rudd?
Thank you very much. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah. Okay, the title of the talk is Kierkegaard's Christian Platonism. I was hoping this would come across as being this sort of really radical, original interpretation. You'll think, wow, nobody's ever thought of that before. Steve Evans spoiled that a little bit last night by his talk interpreting Kierkegaard as more of a Platonist than an existentialist. Well, I'm glad to say as Steve's talk went on, it doesn't really overlap directly, significantly with mine, so I was worried he was just going to say everything I was going to be saying now. In fact, I'll even be disagreeing with him a bit at the end, just as a sting in the tail. So the idea of Kierkegaard as a Christian Platonist, I guess it should be fairly uncontroversial that Kierkegaard was a Christian, but he was a Platonist is a much more controversial claim. It will be rejected, as Steve noted, by those who see him as a philosophical voluntarist and anti-rationalist, the sort of grandfather of Sartrean existentialism, but also by those who see him primarily as a theological anti-philosopher, an essentially biblical thinker pitting Jerusalem against Athens, also opposed by those who like to see Kierkegaard as a proto-postmodernist set on deconstructing the logocentric ontotheology of the Western tradition, otherwise, of course, known as Platonism. And there are more specific textual objections to aligning Kierkegaard with Plato, some of which I will be addressing directly later in my paper. But even if I could persuade you that Kierkegaard was a Platonist, this might not seem to enhance his relevance for our times, to quote the title of this symposium, Kierkegaard, a Christian Thinker for Our Times. For Platonism is not exactly popular at the moment. Much of continental philosophy disparages it for its logocentrism, etc., as noted above. Feminists, ecologists, and others have denounced it for a pernicious dualism, a disvalue of the body and the temporal. Some biblically minded theologians have made similar charges, and have seen Platonism as corrupting Christianity in a quasi-Gnostic direction. And while some analytical philosophers might take a Platonic realism about abstract objects seriously, most are dismissive of the anti-naturalistic, value-based metaphysics of Platonism as a whole. I'm not going to be able in this talk to address all these objections to Platonism, you may not be surprised to know, or even to considering Kierkegaard as a Platonist. I would in any case be more interested in arguing that Plato was not a Platonist in the sense of the hostile stereotypes often associated with that term, and that Kierkegaard was more a follower of the real Plato than a Platonist in that opprobrious sense. But I will try to show why I find some of Plato's views attractive and why I think they are very important and relevant for our times, and why I think Kierkegaard's views are close to his in those respects. I will then consider some of the objections to thinking of Kierkegaard as a latter-day Platonist. follower of Plato rather than Platonist. I've argued at length for interpreting Kierkegaard's view of the self in broadly Platonic terms and for the current defensibility of that Kierkegaardian Platonic view in the book that Heidi mentioned there, Self-Value and Narrative, a Kierkegaardian Approach, Oxford University Press, available from all good booksellers and from the stalls outside there, end of plug. Parts of his paper are aiming to give a sort of overview of some of the argument of that book, so it's developed in more detail there if you're interested. But other parts of the paper address issues which are not directly considered in that book, so there is some new material here as well. Okay, I certainly don't want to suggest that Kierkegaard followed Plato in all things, or even in all important things, nor am I denying that there are important differences between them. What they do have in common, what I want to focus on here, is their understanding of the self as teleologically ordered to the good. Alistair MacIntyre once claimed in his After Virtue that Kierkegaard, quote, rejects any teleological view of human nature, unquote. MacIntyre has been much criticised for this and has indeed now retracted this claim. I will be arguing that Kierkegaard is a teleological thinker in the same basic sense that Plato is. In other words, that they both see the self as naturally ordered to an objective good which exists independently of the self, and that they see the self as only able to find fulfillment in relationship to that good. Kierkegaard, as a Christian Platonist and following the mainstream of Christian thinking from Augustine to Aquinas, identifies the objective Platonic good, the form of good in Plato, with God. This avoids the standard dilemma, derived ultimately from Plato's Euthyphro, with which theological ethics is routinely challenged. That is, on the Christian Platonic view, God neither establishes standards of goodness by an act of arbitrary will, nor is he subject to an independent standard of goodness. His nature or essence simply is goodness. In Augustine's words, quote, this good and that good, take away this and that, and see good itself if you can, so you will see God, who is good, not by another good, but is the good of every good. Quote from Augustine on the Trinity. In this tradition, the self is seen as having a fundamental need for the good. It's unable to be fulfilled, or even to fully be itself, without a proper relation to God / the good. To quote Augustine again, and this is Augustine addressing God in the famous lines at the beginning of his Confessions, you have made us for yourself, and our heart is restless until it rests in you. Kierkegaard is clearly making the same point, albeit here in a drier and less rhetorical style when he writes, this is from Sickness unto Death, the self cannot by itself arrive at or remain in equilibrium, but only in relating to itself by relating to that which has established the whole relation. Unquote. This idea of the necessary relation of the self to the good has faded in much of modernity. The loss of belief in an ontologically basic standard of goodness has left even basic social morality with a precarious status, and the richer notion of ethics as the quest for a good life, for a maximally fulfilling and worthwhile existence, all the more so. This is why many liberal thinkers, following Rawls and Dworkin, have tried to distinguish between the right, that is, basic rules governing interpersonal relationships, and the good, this richer notion of the good life. But in doing so, they've tended, in effect, even if not always in intention, to consign the latter, the good, to the sphere of mere unarguable personal preferences. And it's been plausibly argued by Michael Sandel, Charles Taylor and others, as well as by MacIntyre, that the standards of right are themselves unintelligible without some wider presupposed notion of the good. Well, if a fading of the notion of objective goodness has threatened the coherence of our ethical, or more broadly, our evaluational thought, it's also threatened our ability to arrive at a balanced understanding of the self. For teleological thinkers, the self can only be adequately understood in an evaluative framework. As MacIntyre puts it, teleological thought posits, quote, a threefold schema in which human nature as it happens to be needs to be transformed by the instruction of practical reason and experience into human nature as it could be if it realised its telos. End quote. That's again from After Virtue. If the idea of a telos, that is, the good towards which we are striving, the standard in terms of which we should shape our characters, if that is lost, then the self is left literally without direction. In Sickness Unto Death, Kierkegaard, as I noted above, argues that the self can only properly become itself by relating to the power which established it, i.e. God. He describes the self there as, quote, a synthesis of the finite and the infinite, of the temporal and the eternal, of freedom and necessity. Each of these polarities is, I think, a particular way in which to think about one basic polarity between what I shall call our immanence, that is, our having a fixed, determinate nature which sets limits to what we are and what we can be, and on the other hand, our transcendence, that is, our capacity to take responsibility for ourselves, to shape ourselves, to question and look beyond the limits apparently set for us. For Kierkegaard, these elements can only be held together in a creative tension if the self as a whole is oriented towards the good, i.e. God. It is something of a confirmation of his account that, even on the theoretical level, the abandonment of teleology by most modern thinkers has tended to leave them with accounts of the self that are themselves exaggerations of either immanence or of transcendence. Conveniently eloquent articulations of these radically opposed extremes can be found in Schopenhauer and in Sartre. Schopenhauer's account is, in my terms, one that exaggerates our immanence. He tells us that, this is a nice quote from Schopenhauer, the character of a human being is empirical. Only through experience do we come to know it, not merely in others, but also in ourselves. This is why we are often disillusioned when we discover that we do not possess this or that quality, e.g. justice, unselfishness, courage, in the degree that we fondly assumed. The character of a human being is constant. It remains the same throughout his whole life. Under the changeable mask of his years, his circumstances, and even his cognitions and views, we find the real identical human being like a crab in its shell, quite unchangeable and always the same. End of quote from Schopenhauer. But this idea that we have fixed characters which determine our actions is precisely what Sartre condemned as bad faith. In contrast, Sartre himself, at least the existentialist Sartre of the 1940s, takes the idea of transcendence, of self-creation, about as far as it is possible to do. Quote from Sartre, "What do we mean by saying that existence precedes essence? We mean that man first of all exists, encounters himself, surges up in the world, and defines himself afterwards. If man, as the existentialist sees him, is not definable, it is because, to begin with, he is nothing. He will not be anything until later, and then he will be what he makes of himself. Man is nothing else than that which he makes of himself." End of Sartre quote. These two opposed ways of understanding the self are both expressive of attitudes that Kierkegaard would have considered despairing. The fatalist or determinist, as Kierkegaard puts it, despairs through feeling unable to change him or herself, feeling that his or her character is something fixed and unalterable. The opposite despair is that of supposing that one can make of oneself whatever one pleases, but with the proviso that one can always take apart whatever one has created. Such a self, prizing unlimited freedom, can never really become anything, or therefore relate to anyone. It is some confirmation of Kierkegaard's instincts here that both Schopenhauer and Sartre were clear-headed enough about their respective positions to be deeply pessimistic thinkers. I don't think either would really have disagreed with the Kierkegaardian diagnosis that they were in despair, but both supposed that despair was the result of recognizing clearly enough the reality of the human condition. Of course, many modern philosophers have taken a more cheerful view than this, and have either tried to develop more moderate versions of these radical views or to find some kind of compromise between them. But it's far from clear whether, in the absence of some teleological account of the self, that these attempts can work. And modern philosophy has tended, indeed, either to see the self naturalistically, simply as an element in a deterministic, impersonal world, whose nature is a kind of brute fact, or alternatively to see the self in radically transcendent terms as a principle of autonomous will or reason. As Iris Murdoch has complained, Modern philosophy tends to picture the moral agent, and this is a quote from Murdoch, as an isolated principle of will, inside or beside a lump of being which has been handed over to other disciplines such as psychology or sociology. On the one hand, a Luciferian philosophy of adventures of the will, and on the other, natural science. It's from Murdoch's Sovereignty of Good. Okay, this summary of the problems that we encounter when we give up thinking of the self in teleological and evaluative terms is obviously intended to make the idea of the return to such thinking look appealing. And my debts in all this to MacIntyre should also be quite obvious. But what sort of teleological thinking? The kind that can be adopted with least disturbance to a modern, broadly naturalistic worldview is a kind of scaled-down Aristotelianism, purged of the more Platonic elements which continued to play an important part in the thinking of the historical Aristotle. On this Aristotelian or neo-Aristotelian view, human ethical flourishing is seen as continuous with natural biological flourishing across the animal and even the plant worlds. A living organism is born with certain definite potentials, and it flourishes to the extent that it's able to realise them. It has an at least relatively fixed nature as a member of this or that species, and it is by reference to the essence of its species that we decide whether this or that individual is a good or bad specimen. So a good wolf is strong and fast with sharp teeth and a warm coat. The human case is more complex but not essentially different. To be a good human being is to realise one's distinctively human potentials. Since we are rational, political, cultural, etc. animals, this includes not only straightforward biological flourishing, but also becoming a good reasoner. And that involves both developing practical reason, enabling one to engage in rational social and political dealings with others, but also for full flourishing, developing one's capacity for theoretical reasoning also. Accounts along these lines have been worked out in detail recently by, for instance, Philippa Foot and Rosalind Hursthouse. I certainly don't have the space for a full critique of this naturalistic teleology here, but perhaps the most fundamental worry about it is that it exaggerates the fixity of a human nature, that it takes us to have a more fixed essential nature than we in fact do. In other words, it exaggerates our immanence. What makes a wolf a good wolf is fixed by a more or less determinate biological essence. We don't need to go all the way with Sartre to suspect that human nature is not determinate in anything like as complete a way. At the least, we do have the capacity for a far greater range of behaviours than any other species. And if our capacities for cooperation and nurturing are parts of our humanity, with a claim therefore to be cultivated as human potentials, then why not also our capacities for competition, conflict, destruction? Without an independent criterion to decide which capacities are good, how should we decide which of these apparently equally natural ones to cultivate? As Anna Landstrom puts it in her recent interesting book on Aristotle's ethics, if we were trying to ground ethics in human nature, we would not start with the fact that we are the only animal that makes war on its own, or that we often are jealous, that we torture other human beings, or that we often are selfish. Rather, we might note that we are rational, that we are social, that we can form close relationships. That is, we select good facts about our nature. In order to be able to do that, though, we need a distinction between good and bad already in place. That's the end of the quote from Landstrom. Moreover, our ability to look at our own nature and decide which of our capacities to cultivate and which to inhibit shows that we can transcend ourselves in ways that other animals cannot. We do, as persons, have the capacity to step back from and critically evaluate ourselves and our goals, and to set goals for ourselves, but not only go beyond merely biological goals, but may even undermine them, choosing not to have children, taking risks of our lives for various reasons, etc. The good to which we are ordered, on the neo-Aristotelian view, is the good for us simply as members of our species. But it seems to have no place for a notion of what is simply good, whether or not it benefits us, at least in any observable naturalistic sense. Aristotle himself thought there were things we should do just because of their nobility, or shouldn't do because of their ignobility, whether or not they contributed in any way to our biological flourishing, even if they were directly contrary to it. but it's hard to find a place for that thought in a modern naturalistic version of Aristotelianism. I have to bend down to find my water here. This is only the start of a possible critique, not a knockdown argument against neo-Aristotelianism. But if one is disturbed by these problems, but still attracted to a teleological way of thinking, this might be a reason to look again at the significantly different kind of teleological thinking which derives from Plato. Let us start by considering Socrates' argument for justice in the Republic. The argument seems at first to go as follows. Harmony within the soul, which involves a proper order between its three parts, reason, spirit, and desire, is a good in the non-moral sense. That is a state which anyone can see as desirable. This is our telos, in the sense of being a goal that anyone would naturally want to achieve and will be miserable without. But, so the argument then goes, this good can only be achieved by being just, which means having reason in control of one's soul. So we all have good reason to be just. Critics have, of course, wondered whether there is really any necessary relation between justice in this Platonic sense and justice in a more everyday sense. And it's also been argued that Plato in fact betrays morality in his very attempt to establish it, for he presents it as a sort of means to an end that can be seen to be desirable apart from any moral considerations. I think, though, that what Plato is really arguing for is something subtler. He does indeed claim that it's only by relating to the good, the form of good, that we can achieve psychic harmony. But we don't turn to the good because we can see that doing so is the necessary means to that independently desirable end. Rather, we are, if we attend properly to it, naturally drawn to the good for its own sake. This idea may seem more plausible if we think of what we are being drawn to as the form of beauty, as in the Symposium. I take it that Plato doesn't intend us to think of the Symposium's beauty and the Republic's good as distinct entities. There are alternative ways of characterizing the highest and ultimate form. So our telos, our goal, is in one sense for good or beautiful, that towards which we make our laborious way in both the Republic's myth of the cave and the Symposium's ascent of love. But relating properly to the good brings our souls into harmony. This is neither a means-end relationship nor a fortunate side effect. For the soul's harmony consists in reason being in control of it, but reason, for Plato, is the faculty by which we apprehend the forms and ultimately the good. So the reign of reason and the harmony that it brings ultimately consists in the soul being ruled by its perception of the good. If we are not relating adequately to the good, then we'll feel unhappy, unfulfilled, even if we're not able to articulate what it is we are lacking. So even the disintegrated, tyrannical soul may dimly perceive that an inner harmony would be desirable, but it lacks the ability to understand what that would really involve. So inner harmony is not really a non-moral good that can be appreciated by anyone, and I think the arguments in the earlier books of the Republic that seem to suppose that it is are best thought of as ladders, which by the time we get to the later books, we can see we need to throw away. In presenting Plato this way, and in differentiating his kind of teleological thinking from Aristotle's, I'm trying to rescue him from the powerful critique of eudaimonism, as he calls it, recently developed by John Davenport. On Davenport's account, eudaimonism is the idea that desire has what he calls an erosaic structure, that is, desire, eros in the broadest sense, is a striving to gain what we lack or to actualize what is present in us as potential. Happiness, eudaimonia, is the satisfying of such desire, and human action is to be explained as a quest for the good, which we feel ourselves, either clearly or dimly and confusedly, to lack. Davenport takes this eudaimonism to be the dominant mode of classical thought, both Platonic and Aristotelian. Against it, he argues that it falsely makes all motivation formally, though not materially, egoistic, and ignores ways in which we can be motivated to act by simply perceiving that an act is worth doing, quite apart from any prior need we might feel for it. I cannot engage with the detail of Davenport's enormously rich and complex argument here. But although Plato certainly uses the erosaic model to explain our striving for the good or beautiful, he's also clear that the turning to the good is done for its own sake, not for what it offers to us. We are attracted to the good simply because it is good. It remains true that we have a need for the good and cannot be fulfilled outside it. But we don't turn to it because it will satisfy a need that we are already conscious of having. We may indeed only become aware of our need for the good through finding ourselves drawn to it. I'm not sure whether such considerations should lead us to conclude that Plato was not a eudaimonist in Davenport's sense, or that a sufficiently sophisticated form of eudaimonism is not such a bad thing. In any case, and despite the differences I've insisted on, the Aristotelian and Platonic views of teleology do share certain crucial features. Both see us as having potentials which we need in order to flourish. Both see the good for us as objective, built into the nature of things, not something that we invent. Both see us as having a capacity to understand that good, which then gives us a criterion for consciously deciding how we are to live and how we are to shape ourselves. But where the Aristotelian sees our telos as the realization of our natural potentialities, a state of affairs we may or may not succeed in bringing about, the Platonist distinguishes two senses of telos. Firstly, our telos, our goal, is that to which we need to relate in order to be fulfilled, i.e. the good. Only secondly is the state of affairs, psychic harmony, to be brought about in ourselves. We realize our telos in this second sense only by properly relating to the entity, which is our telos in the first sense. Right, back at last to Kierkegaard. You may have wondered where he had got to. As I noted above, he thinks the self will remain in despair, that is, be unable to synthesize its immanent and transcendent aspects until it is grounded transparently in the power that established it. Its flourishing, therefore, depends on its being properly related to God or the good. But as Kierkegaard makes clear in Purity of Heart especially, one cannot relate properly to the good by willing it for anything except its own sake. To will the good for the sake of any reward is a kind of double-mindedness. And this is the case even if one wills it for the sake of eudaimonia, if eudaimonia is thought of as anything but being in a right relation to the good. The good, as absolute, must be willed for its own sake, but it's only by doing this that the self can become whole. Quote from Purity of Heart, "That the good has its own reward is forever certain. It is not even more certain that God exists, for that is one and the same thing." Here Kierkegaard is clearly identifying God with the good, and the pattern of his thinking about the self and the non-instrumental character of its need for the good is clearly similar to the pattern of Plato's teleological thinking as outlined above. And there is every reason to think this similarity was something Kierkegaard was well aware of and even went out of his way to emphasize. For it's striking to note that Purity of Heart, which is an upbuilding discourse intended for a specifically Christian context on the occasion of a confession, nonetheless contains frequent positive references to or allusions to Socrates and Plato, and even some direct quotes from the Republic. The Platonic nature of Kierkegaard's teleological thinking can also be seen clearly in Sickness Unto Death. For Kierkegaard, as for Plato, the self or soul is composed of elements which may conflict. And for Kierkegaard, as for Plato, the self has a deep need to synthesize or harmonize these elements. This distinguishes them both sharply from the post-Nietzschean thinkers who celebrate inner conflict. And for Kierkegaard, as for Plato, the self can only resolve these elements into a proper harmony through relating itself as a whole to the good. So we have in Kierkegaard the same twofold sense of telos which I noted in Plato. Our telos in the first sense is to achieve a psychological wholeness, but our telos in the second sense is the objectively real good to which we need to properly relate ourselves. But these are not simply separate goals, so that I might achieve one but not the other. The self is only able to hold its opposing elements together if it is directed as a whole towards the good. It is as though a centrifugal force is only held in check by a trajectory of the whole self to that good. Or to put it less negatively, only the overall trajectory enables the potentially conflicting elements to harmonize properly with one another rather than pulling against each other. However, Kierkegaard does not simply follow Plato at this point, and we should note an important difference between them. For Plato, harmony in the soul consists in a proper hierarchical relationship between reason, spirit, and desire in that order. not only does Kierkegaard understand the elements of self differently, transcendence and immanence can't simply be identified with reason and desire in Plato, but he understands their proper relationship as one of balance rather than of hierarchy. Neither immanence nor transcendence should be subordinated to the other, and he discusses in some detail the kinds of pathology that arise when, for instance, possibility is not balanced by necessity or necessity by possibility. There is also an element in Kierkegaard's thought which, if not absent from Plato's, is not expressed as clearly and fully there. This is the recognition of the importance of what we might call relative or intermediate goods. We need above all to relate to God. Quote, "The self cannot by itself arrive at or remain in equilibrium, but only in relating to itself by relating to that which has established the whole relation, from sickness unto death. That the self relates itself not only to God, but also to other finite good things. These include, of course, other persons, but may also include causes, social roles, institutions, places, traditions, things of all kinds. These are the goods celebrated by Judge William in the second part of Either Or, where he argues that the ethical life is built up from the commitments we make to other people and to other finite goods. And it's typically in relating to these things that we come to integrate or synthesize the elements of selfhood. For instance, necessity and possibility are balanced here, since the commitments we make are freely chosen, but not from an unlimited selection of possibilities. Once chosen, they confer limits upon us, while also opening up a range, though not an unlimited one, of further possibilities. Here the judge then agrees with modern philosophers like Bernard Williams or Harry Frankfurt, who've argued that final ends or ground projects are necessary for the leading of a meaningful life. Or as Hubert Dreyfus has put it, according to Kierkegaard, if and only if you let yourself be drawn into a defining commitment, can you achieve that which, while you were in despair, looked impossible, viz. That the two sets of factors, the immanence and transcendence, reinforce each other, so that the more you manifest one, the more you manifest the other. That's from a recent essay by Dreyfus. But for Dreyfus, what matters, it seems, is to commit yourself to something. It doesn't really matter what, so long as you can will it with commitment and passion. More or less anything, it seems, would do. This is not the Kierkegaardian ethical, though. It's closer to what is called in Either Or serious aestheticism. What is distinctive of the ethical life, by contrast, is that such commitments are chosen in the light of an overriding commitment to the good. This doesn't, of course, mean that one wills the good instead of willing particular commitments to specific individuals or places or causes. The point is to will these in the light of the good. It's crucial for us as finite beings that we relate to other finite beings. But first we need to commit ourselves to the good so that we will make those specific commitments that are right for us and make them with the right spirit rather than selfishly or opportunistically. It is true that Kierkegaard in his later signed writings often seems less enthusiastic than the judge about the value of finite particular goods, and works of love in particular has sometimes been read as denigrating particular attachments in favour of a universal neighbour love based in love for God. Plato too, of course, has often been criticised for advocating a commitment to the good which leaves particular loves for individuals behind. But I think that commentators such as Jamie Ferreira and John Lippett have shown that works of love does indeed endorse friendship and romantic love as being of value in their own right, even if that isn't Kierkegaard's main focus in the discussion. And I think also Plato can be defended against the charge of dismissing or losing concern for particular individual loves, though I'm not going to try and do that here. I think we can see then that Kierkegaard's teleological view involves not just the twofold teleology I distinguished in discussing Plato, but a threefold teleology. We become authentic selves by relating properly to ourselves, our telos in the first sense, but we can only do that by relating properly to other people, causes, etc., our telos or teloi in the second sense, and in turn we can only do that by relating unconditionally to the good, our telos in the third and most ultimate sense. Commitment to the good, then, is thus fundamental here. And it should again be emphasised that for Kierkegaard, as for Plato, One makes that commitment to the good just because it is good, not because it is a means to our ends, even the end of achieving psychic harmony or balancing our immanence and transcendence. We can relate properly to ourselves only if we relate to the good. We can only do that if we relate to the good for its own sake. Okay, now let me briefly consider some of the criticisms that might be brought against the claim that Kierkegaard was a follower of Plato. Let me reiterate, I'm certainly not claiming that Kierkegaard follows Plato in all or even in all important respects. Many issues of deep concern to Plato, such as the nature of mathematical truth, were of little interest to Kierkegaard. And of course, as a Christian thinker, Kierkegaard was deeply concerned with issues such as the imitation of Christ, which could have meant nothing to Plato. Even in the discussions of teleology above, I've noted significant differences as well as similarities. And it should be noted that Kierkegaard's great philosophical hero was really Socrates rather than Plato. Here his pseudonyms sometimes distinguish them. So in the postscript, Johannes Climacus claims that Socrates was an existential thinker who focused on living in the temporal in the light of eternal principles, whereas Plato set aside the existential problems and got lost in the contemplation of the eternal. This is probably unfair historically. If it's based simply on the fact that Plato did a lot of writing and Socrates didn't, then the charge would seem to leave Kierkegaard a little bit vulnerable. What is in fact striking about most of Plato's dialogues is that they do not speculate about the nature of the forms. They do provide vividly concrete portrayals of characters and personal interactions. Whenever we do come to a point in the middle dialogues where you might expect him to wheel out a developed theory of forms, what we actually get are images, stories, myths, metaphors, which leave us with the question, how do we live our lives in the light of these images and stories? The most obvious apparent anti-Platonic moment in Kierkegaard's writings also comes in a text attributed to Climacus, the Philosophical Crumbs, to use the title adopted by Marilyn Piety for her recent translation of otherwise known as Philosophical Fragments. There Climacus attempts to invent a theory which would be radically different from Platonic recollection and comes up with Christianity as a result. But the Crumbs is a text that is shot through with irony and should not be taken at face value. In particular, the claim, contra Plato, that the truth is not buried in us, waiting to be brought to the surface by recollection, but that we are outside the truth, that claim seems itself to be undermined by Climacus's assertion that we are sinners who are, quote, polemically opposed to the truth. We can only be polemically opposed to the truth if we know what it is. And we can only be culpable, as opposed to innocently clueless, if we deliberately act against what we know to be right. In Purity of Heart, Kierkegaard, writing in his own name, makes it very clear that on his view, we do indeed have the truth within us. That is why even the most depraved of characters cannot will evil wholeheartedly. They cannot avoid not only retaining some knowledge of what the good is, but even of retaining some longing for it. In Sickness Unto Death, Kierkegaard makes a nuanced but stern critique of what he calls the Socratic definition of sin, according to which no one who really knows the good can act against it, and that therefore sin is ignorance. Kierkegaard points out that if sin is ignorance, then sin does not really exist, for sin is precisely consciousness. This, of course, concedes that to be sinners, we cannot simply lack knowledge of the good. What Kierkegaard now accuses Socrates or Plato of is that they thought that our knowledge of the good was merely innocently forgotten and just needed to be remembered. They failed to understand the role of the will, defiance, in evil-doing. So, quote, Greek intellectuality was too fortunate, too naive, too aesthetic, too ironic, too sinful, to be able to get it into its head that someone would knowingly refrain from doing the good, or, knowing what is right, knowingly do what is wrong. By contrast, Kierkegaard insists that even if it is in a sense true that sin is ignorance, that ignorance is itself a willed state. Hence, sinfulness must consist in the activity whereby a person has worked at obscuring his knowledge. Again, quote from Sickness. We all have a knowledge of the good, but we are frightened by the demands that it makes on us, and so we act to repress that knowledge. So, quote again, sin does not consist in man's not having understood what is right, but of his not wanting to understand it, and in his unwillingness to do what is right. Again, themes that Steve raised yesterday. But even this disagreement between Kierkegaard and Socrates or Plato, as he understood them, takes place against a background of deep agreement. For Kierkegaard and Plato agree that there is a transcendent absolute good, that we have a natural attunement to that good, a knowledge of it, and an ineradicable longing for it. They also agree that we are characteristically unconscious or not fully conscious of that good, and so our very longing for it is obscure to us. According to Kierkegaard, they disagree only on his claim that our partial unconsciousness of the good is itself a willed and culpable state. But in fact, it isn't even clear they really do disagree on this. In the Symposium, after Socrates has recounted Diotima's description of the ascent of love, the drunken Alcibiades lurches in and ends up delivering an encomium on Socrates, in the course of which he says that Socrates is the only person who can make him ashamed of his life. Socrates points him to the good, makes him recollect his original knowledge of it, and he describes how drawn he is to philosophy. But he cannot bring himself to amend his life. So, he says, I refuse to listen to him. I stop my ears and tear myself away from him. I know perfectly well I can't prove he's wrong when he tells me what I should do, yet the moment I leave his side, I go back to my old ways. End of quote. Whatever the so-called Socratic view, Plato, by introducing Alcibiades at this point, couldn't have made it much clearer his own recognition that sin is more than simply ignorance. Or as Kierkegaard says, if sin is ignorance, then ignorance is not a merely intellectual failing. It's also worth noting at this point Gilbert Mailander's reading of the allegory of the cave in The Republic. According to Mailander, the question, who will lead us out of the cave, and this is a quote from Mailander, this question is not easily answered, since by Plato's reckoning the cave is of our own making. If we do not see what is good, the failure is not only in our intellect. We are ignorant because at some fundamental level of our being we do not want to see. End quote. Hence the knowledge which would be needed to overcome such ignorance must be existentially transformative knowledge, erotic knowledge, as Plato would say, rather than a purely intellectual assent to well-justified propositions. And this, I think, is precisely how Plato conceives of knowledge as the form of good. Okay, finally, in conclusion, let me conclude by considering one last point on which Kierkegaard and Plato do seem to differ significantly. I'm well aware there are plenty of others. This is not intended to be comprehensive. Steve Evans, following Philip Quinn, has claimed that in works of love especially, Kierkegaard has a divine command ethics. But clearly there's no such thing in Plato. Indeed, Plato's Euthyphro, as I noted above, is the source for the most influential argument against divine command ethics. However, even if Evans is right in his claim that Kierkegaard does have a divine command ethics, and other commentators such as Jamie Ferreira have disagreed on that point, the conflict between Kierkegaard and Plato is less sharp than it might appear. For the divine command theory that Evans ascribes to Kierkegaard and endorses in his own right is, as he was telling us yesterday, not the simple voluntarist theory according to which good and evil are established by the ultimately arbitrary decrees of a God who is defined initially simply in terms of sovereign power rather than goodness. Instead, Evans follows Robert Adams' so-called modified divine command theory. According to Adams, Adams identifies God with the Platonic good. He is a Christian Platonist. And so, ontologically, in his view, the value of things derives from their participation in the absolute good that is God's essential nature. The goodness of things is therefore objective and intrinsic to the things themselves, since their relationship to, their participation in, the good is not an accidental fact about them, but essential to what they are. But their value, according to Adams, underdetermines what we should do. It doesn't prescribe a specific set of moral duties. Specific moral obligations, according to Adams and Steve Evans, are created by God's commands. These are not arbitrary, since they derive from a nature that is good. God could not command what is evil without contradicting his own nature. But it seems that within those limits he could have commanded somewhat different things, or refrained from commanding some of the things that he does. Well, if Kierkegaard does have a divine command ethic, it would have to be along these lines, since he certainly does not suppose moral obligations to be created by the arbitrary fiat of a god initially defined purely in terms of sovereignty. However, setting exegesis aside for a moment, I do think that once we have accepted Platonism, whether or not in its theistic form, it does render further divine commands unnecessary. Things have real intrinsic value of their own. This is ultimately due to their participation in the good, though as Adams notes, one may rightly appreciate the value of something without having the right, or indeed any, metaphysical account of why it has value. But the value of things themselves is enough to put me under obligation, without the need of further divine commands. The value of persons itself puts me under obligation not to harm them, and more positively, to act in ways which promote their flourishing. Evans does say that, quote from Steve Evans, divine commands would not necessarily simply reinforce what it would be best to do anyway, for there might be several alternative principles equally good, and a divine command could give one of those principles an obligatory status it would otherwise not have had relative to those alternatives. This is from Steve's book, Kierkegaard's Ethic of Love. Well, it's certainly true that the intrinsic value of things may leave my obligations in many ways indeterminate, but it can place absolute and specific demands on me. I should not spread malicious lies about my rival. I should help this injured person here. And where the value of things does leave my duties indeterminate, or in the Kantian language, imperfect, I can see no reason for necessarily making them less so. For if the alternative principles really are equally good, then what basis would God have for commanding one rather than another of them? We do, of course, find ourselves all the time giving preference to one good thing, good person, cause, artwork, place, cat, over others equally good in themselves. We may do so on the basis of our personal histories with these rather than those things, or we may do so simply on the basis of what Susan Wolfe has helpfully called the personal affinity that we feel with some things, persons, cats, etc., more than with others. But it would be a dubiously anthropomorphic view of God, albeit one with significant prima facie biblical warrant, to suppose that God has such personal preferences. And even if he does, why command that we share them if they are simply personal preferences on God's part? Well, Platonism is a religiously based ethic. The goodness of things only makes sense in a metaphysical and ultimately theological context, so it is not a naturalistic alternative to divine commands as a basis for ethics. I should say that I found Steve Evans' critique of broadly naturalistic theories of ethics very convincing. But given the goodness of the world God created and the goodness of the particular things in it, I must admit I can't see a need for further divine commands to establish our obligations. Kierkegaard does, however, insist, especially in works of love, that God commands us to love and lays great stress on the obligatory commanded nature of Christian love. How does this relate to the idea that agapeistic love is required of us because it is a proper response to the real worth of our neighbour? If it's just a response to our neighbour, why do we need to have it commanded by God? My suggestion here is that we should look at the ingrained habits of thought that Kierkegaard was trying to break us out of when he insists in the commanded nature of love. In this case, I think his target is the idea that love is simply a matter of inclination, something we might feel or not feel as the case may be. To insist that we are commanded to love our neighbour is to insist that it isn't relevant whether we find our neighbour attractive or agreeable. What Kierkegaard's insisting on is the reality of the universal obligation to love. But this is not itself groundless, nor is it grounded in an arbitrary decree. It's grounded in the real worth of the neighbour, which is in turn grounded in the neighbour's relation to God as created in his image. I think then that by talking of divine command here, Kierkegaard means to emphasise the obligatory nature of agapeistic love and the ultimate grounding of that obligation in God's goodness. I don't think that Kierkegaard is beyond that, trying to establish the sort of thing which is now categorised as a divine command theory. But even if I'm wrong about this, and even if Steve is right exegetically, Kierkegaard's divine command theory would be a supplement to his Platonism and not a replacement for it. He is certainly not asserting a kind of occamist voluntarism which would be incompatible with the Platonic strand of his thought which I have been trying to trace here. Thank you.
Many thanks for this illuminating and thought-provoking paper. It's truly an honor to have this chance to respond to your excellent work. As I understood your paper, at its heart is the claim that Kierkegaard and Plato share a certain way of understanding the self and its relation to the good, namely that the self relates to the good teleologically. You distinguish very helpfully between a certain kind of modern naturalistic Aristotelian teleology and Platonic teleology. In short, rather than focusing solely on the realization of a set of eminent natural potentialities, Plato distinguishes a two-tiered telos. As human persons, we strive for a state of inner harmony, but this eminent telos is only meaningful in relation to a transcendent telos, the objective form of the good or the beautiful to which we relate ethically. Kierkegaard, you argue, adopts and expands Plato's approach. I agree. And with your assessment, I also agree with your assessment that this kind of Pharisaic teleology need not devolve into a crass eudaimonism. Additionally, I agree with your comment that Kierkegaard is concerned with putting the existing human in a place of creative tension between the poles of finitude and infinity, necessity and possibility. Kierkegaard achieves this creative tension by describing the human self in relation to God. The God-creature relation ensures that the person is understood as established and therefore finite, against Sartre's account of radical, unbound humanity. However, our relation to God as a transcendent telos also calls us beyond ourselves. Indeed, our powers of freedom and imagination are directed toward God. More importantly, only a teleological ordering toward something transcendent can generate properly ethical striving. I take it that Kierkegaard's condemnation of Kantian autonomy as mere experimentation, incapable of functioning as a viable source of ethics, relies upon just such an intuition. In this broad sense, then, I agree that Kierkegaard can be thought of as a kind of Platonist. Certainly, aspects of Kierkegaard's writings resonate with the Platonic, non-eudaimonistic teleological framework that you describe. Further, I agree with much of your diagnosis of the problems of modern ethics since the abandonment of the teleological. However, I remain somewhat unconvinced that the kind of Platonism you ascribe to Kierkegaard is really the best way to characterize Kierkegaard's own thought. My response is not able to address everything that you talk about in the paper, but I bring up two questions. First, I question whether the status of philosophical fragments, or crumbs, as an ironic and intentionally self-defeating parody really justifies the idea that Kierkegaard actually espoused a Platonic doctrine of recollection after all. Second, and relatedly, I question your suggestion that Kierkegaard must have had a broadly Platonic account of our ability to recollect the good at the heart of his ethical teleological account of the human self. To end, I suggest instead that Kierkegaard had an unavoidably Christological ethic at the heart of his anthropology that cannot be thought of as simply a further specification of a fundamental Platonism. Kierkegaard on recollection. I agree that Fragments is shot through with irony. Indeed, the Climacus of Postscript points out the earlier work's teasing audacity, which even invents Christianity, and its parody of speculative thought. But this by no means indicates that Kierkegaard himself actually believed that we, as you say, do indeed have the truth within us in a Platonic sense. Let me briefly explore the complex status of recollection in Kierkegaard's thought by reading Fragments in light of both concept of irony and postscript. Kierkegaard's Climacus famously conflates Platonic and Socratic recollection in Fragments, and John Stewart suggested that this conflation allows us to see Climacus' farcical advance beyond Socrates as part of Kierkegaard's gleeful parody of Martinson's irritating claims to have advanced beyond this or that famous philosopher. But Kierkegaard and Climacus elsewhere make a careful distinction between Socratic and Platonic recollection, and it's within this distinction that perhaps we can see Kierkegaard's own assessment of recollection. The difference between Socrates and Plato's versions of recollection for Kierkegaard is located largely in their uses of the notion. In concept of irony, while discussing Socratic insistence on virtue's unteachability, Kierkegaard condemns Plato's use of recollection as a straightforward thesis. He writes, "It would be Platonic to fortify existence by the upbuilding thought that man is not driven empty-handed out into the world, by calling to mind his abundant equipment through recollection." End quote. In contrast to this illegitimate tendency toward speculation, Kierkegaard notes that the genuinely Socratic consists in, quote, disparaging all actuality and directing man to a recollection that continually retreats further and further back toward a past that itself retreats so far back in time that no one could remember. In other words, Kierkegaard Socrates uses the notion of recollection not to engender epistemological confidence about virtues, or as the case may be, about the good, but to reduce a person to a genuine state of aporia, a paradoxical knowledge of one's own ignorance. Yet this is an aporia that insists on continuing the search, not with Platonic confidence and recollection, but with what Climacus describes as Socratic faith, and the possibility of someday recognizing the truth or virtue to which the thesis of recollection refers. Climacus in the postscript further confirms this reading of a genuinely Socratic recollection. He tells us that Socrates, unlike Plato, quote, continually parts from the thesis of recollection because he wants to exist, end quote. Recollection in Socrates' hands is thus a useful myth, a thesis from which he continually departs, but which he does not simply abandon. Used in this way, recollection reduces us to aporia, but also engenders a kind of existential faith in the possibility of finding truth. Thus, Fragments is indeed something of a parody, whose arguments implode. But perhaps the takeaway from this implosion should not be that Kierkegaard actually espoused Platonic recollection after all. Rather, Climacus' farcical attempt to out-speculate Martins, or Plato, i.e. in claiming to have gone beyond Socrates in his discovery of Christianity, is itself an affirmation of Kierkegaard's abiding preference for Socratic aporia over and against Plato's confidence rooted in the thesis of recollection. Indeed, in a certain sense, the Climacus writings conspicuously fail ever to get beyond Socrates. In keeping with the arguments in Fragments that truth and faith cannot be taught or imparted by a human teacher, Climacus, at the end of the postscript, remains utterly incapable of explaining the difference between Socrates and Christian faith. Carefully maintaining that religiousness be, or paradoxical religiousness, cannot be explained or understood, Climacus nonetheless offers several candidate analogies for paradoxical religiousness, all based upon Socrates. Socrates always remained Kierkegaard's best analogy to the, according to Kierkegaard, unteachable truths of Christianity and Christian faith. Only Christ is the teacher for Kierkegaard, not only in Fragments, but throughout the corpus. 2. Kierkegaard on sin, ethics, and Christ. But what are we to make of Kierkegaard's insistence that the Christian notion of sin, in contrast to the Greek equation of sin with ignorance, requires culpable, willful rejection of the truth, a rejection that implies a prior knowledge of the truth? Should this prior knowledge be equated with a generally Platonic recollection of the good and the true? In light of the evidence above from concept of irony and postscript, I can't imagine that Kierkegaard would want to say that. Yet the dilemma of what we might call sin's culpable ignorance remains. I don't think that Kierkegaard ever resolved this dilemma to his own satisfaction, but we can trace the basic features of his approach. In Fragments, Climacus describes what I take to be something very like Kierkegaard's own approach to the relation of explanatory theories, such as the thesis of recollection, to the paradoxes of existence. He writes, quote, "The contradiction of existence is explained by positing a pre, as needed. By virtue of a prior state, the individual has arrived at his present, otherwise unexplainable state. Or by positing a post, as needed. On another planet, the individual will be better situated, and in consideration of that, his present state is not unexplainable." Excuse me. In other words, explanation is a retrograde, or a projective act, that attempts to render intelligible our present concrete existence in terms of a past or future state of affairs. These myths of explanation may have a place. Like Socrates and his anti-Platonic use of recollection, the purpose of these myths of explanation should not be to distract us from our existence, but should instead be used to motivate a certain kind of relationship to our concrete situation, a kind of coming to terms with rather than overcoming the contradictions of existence. And in fact, in Concept of Anxiety, Vigilius Hoffniensis offers exactly such an account of original sin. He warns against misunderstanding the story of the pre-fall state and the once-and-for-all sin of Adam as a causal explanation for our own sinfulness. Rather, the story of Adam's fall from innocence ought to be understood as a narrativization of each and every human's concrete situation of being a sinner. In a way that closely mirrors Socrates' ironic use of the thesis of recollection, Hoffniensis writes, quote, when thought met with difficulties regarding the fact of human sin, an expedient was seized upon in order to explain at least something. A fantastic presupposition was introduced, the loss of which constituted the fall as the consequence. The advantage gained thereby was that everyone willingly admitted that a condition such as the one described was not found anywhere in the world, end quote. In other words, the important theme is that, dogmatically speaking, we are in fact sinners, and theoretical explanations that seem to reveal how this came to be should only be used to place us in the correct existential mood in relation to that fact. Our sinfulness is an existential contradiction relating to freedom and culpability and so forth, so thought posits a retrograde explanation. An appropriate Socratic use of this explanation, Hoffniensis tells us, would be to support the dogmatic assertion of the universality of sin. For nowhere does the fantastical state of unimpeded harmony with God actually exist. An inappropriate use of the thesis would be to treat it as an actual explanation of sin, for sin is not the outcome of prior states, but the product of freedom. Concept of anxiety tellingly avoids appealing to a Platonic recollection of the good to ground a notion of sin's culpability. Rather, the Platonic recollection of the good might be thought of as something akin to Kierkegaard's own description of the Christian narrative of original innocence and original sin. Used correctly, these explanations can help us achieve a correct existential stance vis-a-vis some concrete feature of human existence, whether that be Socratic aporia or human sinfulness, but it would be a mistake to suppose that our retrograde explanations for some existential contradiction constitute the truth of our existence. In closing, I would like to suggest that perhaps Kierkegaard would have us understand his ethical teleological account of the human person, not through a Platonic recollection of the good, but rather through a supremely offensive encounter with Christ. Kierkegaard consistently identifies Christ as the source of dogmatic content, especially of the concrete fact of human sin. What could formerly only be understood in pagan thought as the frailty of finitude, or mere ignorance, is now revealed by Christ as the sinful opposition of the human to God. Only Christianity posits sin. For Kierkegaard, the dogma of sin is now the starting point for a distinctively Christian ethical striving toward becoming a self. Echoing the concern in Fragments that at the bottom of all human attempts to attain a knowledge of God, there madly lurks the capricious arbitrariness that knows it itself has produced the God, Hofniensis describes the first ethics, a purely objective and speculative investigation into abstract, idealized goodness, apart from dogmatics and revelation. This kind of ethics can only generate an idolatrous form of ethical ideality through metaphysical light-mindedness, as he says. But the dogma of sin introduced by Christ initiates a second ethics. The first ethics may have been able to generate abstract ideals that called forth existential approximations, but Christ's revelation of sin, and more especially Christ's status as the human exemplar so emphasized throughout Kierkegaard's late direct discourses, initiates a different quality of ethical striving. Christ decisively reveals God's holiness and humanity's sin, but more importantly, perhaps, in the presence of the God-man, who is humanity's divine exemplar, the ideal paradoxically made real. Ethical ideality is no longer something that humans may strive to approximate. It is rather the unconditional requirement of the unconditioned God. Christ's paradoxical union of eternal ideality with a temporal concrete human life ensures that there is no leniency when it comes to ethical requirements. Or, as Kierkegaard would say in his late journals, Christ and Christianity never allow for, quote, to a certain degree when it comes to ethics. For Kierkegaard, only the unconditional requirement embedded in the asymmetrical relation of God and humanity, and revealed and concretized by the God-man status as our unfollowable exemplar, puts a human being in a sufficiently tension-filled experience of inwardness, passion, and the ethical striving to become a self before God. I respectfully suggest that there seems to be good textual evidence, then, that Kierkegaard doubted that a generalized Platonic notion of the good, and humanity's imminent recollection of this transcendent good, could accomplish the same work accomplished by Christ's presence as the revelation of God and the exemplar of humanity. Thank you.
Should I just say a few words in response?
Sure.
Yeah.
Please.
No, thanks very much for your reading of my my work there and response to it. It's very interesting. Doing there. I take it that a large part of it is precisely to get us away from thinking this is a theoretical difference here between Christianity and, well, Platonism is really a sort of stalking horse for Hegelianism or Danish versions of it or whatever. That the point is it is initially presented as there's this epistemological difference. Can we find this account of, which will be different from that of recollection and will give us a different epistemological understanding? But it turns out, once you think through what's really going on there and all the ways it deconstructs itself and so on, that it's not really an epistemological issue at all. It's an issue about the will. What the point is not that I'm ignorant of it and it needs to be brought to me, but that I don't want to see it. And that is, reiterated very clearly in Sickness Unto Death in the sort of passages I was discussing there. And again, in Purity of Heart, this very strong insistence, we know the good. Even the most depraved of people, can't entirely suppress their sense of the good, and so they remain internally conflicted. The distinction between Platonic and Socratic recollection is interesting. I mean, I touched on that very briefly as in the postscript. I mean, frankly, I think either Climacus or Kierkegaard is overplaying his hand there. I mean, just as a claim about Socrates and Plato, and particularly as all the philosophically interesting knowledge we have of Socrates comes from Plato anyway, so, you know, how do you draw the line between them? I do think that he is there attempting, I mean, it's part of his polemic against the speculative thought and so on, and his endorsement of, you know, existential thinking. And I think Socrates and Plato kind of become labels for those in the postscript. I do think if you take that as a claim about Plato, it's pretty unfair to Plato. I do think that, you know, Plato is an existential thinker, and I think, you know, this is why he writes the dialogues. This is why he writes to provoke us, you know, to our understanding of the good. And the status recollection has for him, does he, you know, literally believe in this, you know, stories about past lives and the choices we make? Well, perhaps he sort of believes it. It's a myth, it's a story, he gives various versions of it. I don't think he's really concerned with it primarily as a causal explanation. I think he is concerned with it as a myth that makes vivid to us our current situation. You know, there is this truth within us. We can be stimulated to search for it. I mean, even in the Meno, when he first introduces the recollection, he does have Socrates say, I don't know if you can really say that this is definitely the truth, but believing it will make us search for the truth and not give up. It's very William James almost 2,000 years early. So I do think of that as being sort of existentially oriented. The question about you know, the significance of Christ, the role of sin, and so forth. I mean, I think I agree with you that Kierkegaard is kind of conflicted on this. I mean, you get the sort of Lutheran or hyper-Lutheran kind of thing that, you know, Christ is the only sign of anything, and apart from this, it's all just darkness and damnation. But then he looks at Socrates, and he really can't quite bring himself to believe that. I mean, Socrates is, you know, this genuine ethical hero. He can't give up that, and so he sometimes, I think, goes back and forth a bit on that. The question, though, I mean, certainly, you know, he presents it, and it's often presented by many thinkers as, you know, what is decisively new about Christianity is the emphasis on sin, on the will, that we, you know, we can't manage to, you know, will the good, even if we can sort of know it. I mean, Augustine, of course, the classic account, you know, what I got from the Platonists was this true understanding of God and the good, but then I found I couldn't relate myself to it. It's the will that needed, and that's where Christianity comes in. Certainly, I mean, there's something right about that. I mean, I do think Platonism is a religious philosophy, but it's not a religion in the sense that it's a way of, you know, living structured by, you know, prayer, meditation, ritual, whatever, to try to bring oneself into relation to the good. If there is that in Plato, you know, it's not really there set out in his dialogues. Which is not to say that it perhaps couldn't be. And I do think this question of the idea of sin, that it's only Christianity that introduced the idea of sin, and that, you know, the Socratic definition, as I've argued in the paper, I do think there are reasons, and of course one would have to go much more into Plato's texts, to have the sense that there is in Plato some sense of, you know, sin. It's not just ignorance, it's will. It's the willed turning away from the good. And there is this question which comes up in Mailander, and I'm grateful to my colleague Peter Jurten for putting me on to Mailander, and he is a Lutheran theologian, but he is suggesting, you know, there is this concept of you know, something like original sin. You know, we create the cave, and then the question is, how do we get ourselves out of it? Well, there isn't a direct answer to that, but you know, there is a sense that the question is being asked, at least. But, you know, I think, yeah, I mean, certainly Kierkegaard is not just the Platonist, and, you know, the Platonic elements interact in his Christian Platonism, as with anyone who can be described as a Christian Platonist, is a big, complicated question, and probably cracks will always show. But Yeah. Thank you. Sorry. Marilyn, yeah.
I really like that comparison you draw between Plato and Kierkegaard. And you said something early in your talk, and you sort of said it just now, but not quite so thoroughly, about how for Plato we have to have, in some sense, put ourselves in the cave. I mean, it seems to me that it's difficult to reconcile the doctrine of recollection with the allegory of the cave, unless, you know, we have made ourselves forget. You know, we haven't forgot just contingently by being born into another life or something, but we put ourselves down in the cave. And there's an interesting parallel in Crumbs where Kierkegaard talks about being bound to untruth. And it reminds me so much of, you know, the allegory of the cave and how we're, you know, chained in the wrong direction. And then there are the several places in the postscript where Kierkegaard talks about being faced in the wrong direction, you know, asking someone who's you know, on his way to a particular town or whatever, who asks someone, stops and says, you know, is this the road to whatever town? And the person says yes, but, you know, forgets to mention that he's heading the wrong direction.
Yes, if you just turn around and go back the other way.
Which is the same language that you have in the allegory of the cave. The only difference, I suppose you could say, is that for Plato, you're sitting stationary in the cave, whereas for Kierkegaard, you're walking in the wrong direction. But I think the parallels are much stronger than people generally appreciate. And I think you're right, that Plato is an existential thinker. And I mean, I'm just curious as to how, if I understood your paper correctly, you're not actually saying that Kierkegaard understood himself this way as a Christian Platonist, so much as that's what he in fact was.
That's the minimal claim I would make.
Yeah.
I do think, though, I mean, it really struck me actually rereading Purity of Heart, first part of Fine Discourses and Various Spirits, just how often he referred to Socrates there, and he has all these quotes from the Republic which he's doing.
I think it's deliberate,
and that's not in a philosophical work. This is in a upbuilding discourse, written for Christians on a Christian occasion. He's doing that very deliberately.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right about that. I just haven't decided how closely he aligns himself with Plato. But I think you're right. I think there's something like sin in Plato, and that Kierkegaard actually did appreciate that, and that he draws much more from Plato than people generally understand. And I think maybe part of that is because of some of the remarks he makes about Plato in Concept of Irony. And I can't remember exactly what he says, but later on he says, I was just wrong. I was just wrong about Plato and Socrates, and that purported distinction in the Concept of Irony. So.
Yeah. And actually your comment, your reminder of the road imagery, there, it just reminded me that in the Meno, one of the examples of knowledge is, do you know the road to, I think it's Larissa, where you get, do you have true opinion or do you have knowledge about it? And it seems it's just an epistemological example, but I wonder if that actually was in the back of Kierkegaard's mind. I mean, you're trying to get somewhere and, you need to know the right way. Yeah.
Thank you for your paper, Dr. Rudd. I want to voice a word of support to Mr. Marr's report about, in Kierkegaard, an important distinction between Socrates and Plato. Off the top of my head, to your point, you say, well, Plato gives us Socrates anyway, right? All the important philosophical questions come from Plato, so why not see the conjunction there? For Kierkegaard, that is not, in fact, the case. In his dissertation on the concept of irony, Plato is not even the most determinative interpreter of Socrates' form. It's Aristophanes in the clouds. Right. Specifically because Kierkegaard's understanding of Socrates as an ironist in his relation to the comic. So it's as irony, which is why he values Socrates. Which leads to the point on Purity of Heart, which I admit I haven't read very recently, so you probably go through my mind. But it's the first section of Upbuilding Discourses in Various Spirits. Well, he has a journal entry where he divides the three sections of Upbuilding Discourses in Various Spirits and says the first part is irony. The second part is humor. And by irony, that's why I suggest he's quoting Socrates over and over, because Socrates for Kierkegaard is the preeminent ironist.
Yeah.
And so when you see Socrates rightly, when you see the Republic rightly, you're very right to see it. I think Kierkegaard is thinking Socrates, not necessarily Plato. And I'll conclude with one final journal entry that came to my mind. This is more of a theological point, but it shows Kierkegaard does distinguish Socrates and Plato. The entry citation is not quite here, but I could come up with it if I had to. Where Kierkegaard says, okay, so let's look at Socrates. Socrates is the existential. He's the existential. And then along comes Plato, the systematizer. And Kierkegaard asks, he says, who is greater, Socrates or Plato? He says, if you ask the assistant professors, they'll say Plato is greater. And then Kierkegaard says, but then you would have to require that they be consistent and say that theologians are greater than Christ. And so, for Kierkegaard's point, Socrates lives his philosophy. He's the existential, whereas Plato is the systematizer and the ontology. So, I actually think you make many good points, Dr. Rhodes, but I would disagree. I think it's important for Kierkegaard to distinguish between Socrates and Plato, and perhaps Mr. Martin is correct on the issue of recollection in particular.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is important to him to try to make a distinction there, but I do think it's his distinction between the speculative philosopher and the existential thinker. And he's getting the distinction between, say, Hegel versus Hamann, or Lessing, or whatever, or Martinson versus him. I think putting the labels Plato and Socrates on it, I mean, it's something he does do at points, but I don't think historically it is particularly plausible. I mean, and to come back to your first point, I mean, it's right, in the concept of irony, he does look carefully at all the sources, he looks at Xenophon, he looks at Aristophanes. He does then, as Marilyn mentioned, though, in a later journal entry, say, oh, what a Hegelian fool I was dismissing Socrates in the concept of irony. And, I mean, again, with regard to the strictly historical question, not many people think Aristophanes was giving an insightful picture of Kierkegaard of Socrates rather than a caricature.
I almost say that Kierkegaard's opinion of the historical question is slightly different from maybe your and I opinion.
Yeah, so right. I mean, is he being fair to Plato? And I think not. Does he want to make the distinction? Well, at times he does, and he is wanting to use it polemically so as to have this Socrates-Christ relationship, which is obviously important to him from throughout the authorship, and then of course compare the people who wrote them up, and then you have to say the theologians. But I thought the actual comparison ought to be Socrates to Plato and Christ to the gospel writers, who might be a little higher than the theologians. But, there we are. Yeah, sorry, I'm not keeping track on that.
Let me follow up on that slightly. I think we've got to the point where we can distinguish between Kierkegaard's hermeneutic of Socrates, Plato, and what the actual case might be, sort of given our relative independence. So I think we have to move forward from that particular point. I was going to make the point originally that it's now unnecessary. But we have to kind of find out sort of what's at stake in that. In other words, what follows from that. Because obviously, if you get by the hermeneutic point, which is conceded, we can still fall back sort of on, well, what actually is the case. I think there are two things sort of that I'd like to say. The first thing sort of is a historical point, but it's connected and coupled with a systematic point. It is interesting that Kierkegaard is prepared to negotiate with philosophy, despite the fact that he's not prepared to negotiate with Hegel. And the reason why he's not prepared to negotiate with Plato is it may be a botched, degenerative Platonism, but as far as he's concerned, it's a delivery system sort of for dogmata, such as the immortality of the soul, where there's no thinking done and so forth. So we can find out sort of why it is the case that he wants to sever the link between Plato and Socrates in the way he does. The historical point is that he has precedent in Hamann for this. So, I mean, he's precedent in various other figures for all kinds of things, but he has precedent in Hamann, in Socratic memorabilia, that what you can think about is you can think about positively the relation between Socrates and Christ. And of course, Socrates is negotiation, which is Luther himself says, I'm not going to negotiate, so we only have the whole philosophy. This sort of is a turn. You can negotiate, but you negotiate sort of very strictly, and you do not give away sort of what is functioning as axioms. I think Christ will be the axiom. So I think that is very crucial. But the real question then is that if it is the case that from Kierkegaard's point of view, and his point of view has to win out here rather than the meta point of view negotiating between Plato and Kierkegaard, if it is the case that Christ and sin, that particular pair, Christ more than sin because the solution is more than the problematic, if it is the case that epistemology plays almost no role, I mean, I think one can concede that Socrates, as an indicator of Plato, there's more than reason involved, and that is that there is inhibition, and that inhibition comes from will. But if it's the case that you've upped the ante, that is that only inhibition is involved, and that every time so that we are thinking, we have to understand the context of thinking, and every time we're thinking therefore means that thinking is distorted, right? Then I think you have to start raising the question whether your main argument that Kierkegaard is a teleological thinker is going to work at all. That is, if he is going to say that Socrates and or Plato are only going to be admitted if they agree that reason will fail and will have failed utterly, you can't say one is oriented towards God, well, you have no cognitive competence with respect to what that's going to look like. So it's not divine, it's not voluntarism. It's just simply the incapacity to have a path. So if Kierkegaard is going to suggest something about Plato and suggest that he has to be reduced to Socrates, and Socrates is a reducible entity with respect to cognitive competence, that does get to the overall issue as whether you can say that Kierkegaard has a teleological ethic. So I do think the debate about interpretation gets to the issue that I think is the major issue here, whether so that you can have teleology in Kierkegaard.
Yeah. Not sure I followed all of that, but certainly you have this problem. How do we will the good? Even if we can sort of find out we're in the cave, how do we get out of it? Plato doesn't really give us much of an answer to that. Nonetheless, he seems to point out the predicament. And this, comes back to some of the things Steve was saying last night, that in, the quote from Climacus, you've got to have worked your way through religiousness A before B can make sense to you. You've got to understand the question to which, B is offering itself as an answer. And in that sense, I think, if a teleological ethicist is defined as someone who says we can just achieve the good purely by our own efforts, then that's not going to sit well with a theology of grace, obviously. But if the teleological ethic is saying we can only find fulfillment through relationship to our good, and that's only possible through that relation to that good, which makes sense of our being able to have these intermediate relations, then it does seem to me that is a teleological ethic that is present in Kierkegaard. Yeah.
Maybe we need to think about the fact that the four causes is, particularly teleology, is Aristotle's primary critique of Plato on the form of the good. So in ethics, he attacks the form of the good precisely because he can't see how it causes anything. And he has he's come up with his handy nifty, based on the metaphor of the artist, in four causes, but the good doesn't cause in any particular form of a good wouldn't cause in any particular way. And so he's okay thinking perhaps the form of the good is some sort of telos. But I think that's precisely what Plotinus adds, is that he recovers the form of the good as it's not just a form. See, if it's a form, then it's subject to attack on the basis of how causation works. But Plotinus is going to say, look, four causes works really well when we're going from being to becoming. Doesn't work very well when we're talking about relationships and being, or beyond being. And so we need to think of other metaphors to describe how good causes. And good, and I think a Christian Platonist is going to say, well, that's a bit too far because your good is so transcendent it doesn't have any relationship with the world. But it actually, the more you talk, the more I almost wonder if there might be a third source for Socrates here, and that would be Augustine's city of God. We tend to neglect, I'm trying to say hagiography,
Hagiography?
oh, you know, the term that we use with Dodd's, they're basically the systems of history and like the accounts of history, the doxographers. We tend to ignore the doxographers. And Augustine remains a doxographical source for Socrates, and he reconfigures Socrates in terms of happiness as the final end. But it's a final end that is personal and not just some sort of cause or form. And I think that if you're going for Christian Platonism and Kierkegaard, I'm thinking you're going towards non-Augustinian city of God sort of Platonism,
Right.
especially if you're talking about teleology.
Yeah, I mean, well, historically, obviously there's the history of Christian Platonism, and a large part of it passes through Plotinus and then on to Augustine, though there are other streams, particularly in the East. And clearly Kierkegaard reads Augustine, and he picks up a lot from that tradition. I mean, there seem to be two questions. I mean, one is the sort of metaphysical question, how does the good cause? And in Plotinus, you get this story about how everything emanates from the good. In Plato, you get just one bit of imagery, and as usual, which is why I think Plato is less a metaphysical thinker than he's often supposed to be. And then you get, of course, Christian Platonists having this more elaborate account of deliberate creation, and placing the forms in the mind of God and so on. So you've got all that sort of debate about metaphysics of creation, and that is something that Kierkegaard does not enter into. I mean, that's that sort of speculative theology, which is not to say, he obviously accepts some notion of creation, but it's not something that he writes about directly. What he's concerned with is the teleology in the sense of our directedness to the good. And I think, for both Platonism and Christianity, the good is ultimately the creative force from which everything derives. I think that's clear even in Plato. The question is, though, the ascent, how we make the return to God. And in that sense, that's the sense in which the good, in some sense, exercises, to use another of Iris Murdoch's images, this magnetic pull on us. But yeah, I mean, there is the descent and the ascent, as it were.
Good time for maybe one more quick question.
Sorry. Yeah.
It's a quick question. Okay. So, what do you think, for Kierkegaard, is the relationship between Christ and the good? Does Christ just embody the good, or is he the good?
30 seconds.
Yeah. Quick answer. Yes.
Question is one.
Okay. I mean, I suppose the answer for a Christian Platonist is going to be that God is the good, God is Trinity, Christ is the incarnation of one person of the Trinity, therefore Christ is 1/3 of the good. Though, of course, you don't want to do that with the Trinity and say this and that bit and that bit. So, I'm not sure I could answer much more than that at this point. I mean, obviously, in terms of Kierkegaard's writing and thinking, Christ as the exemplar, the model of the good, is of crucial importance. And he obviously wants to say, of course, that Christ is more than that. Socrates is an exemplar of the good. There may be many others, but Christ has the status of the God-man, the eternal in time, and clearly it is the good that is being presented there. And I think that is kind of crucial. This is another point Steve Evans has sort of insisted on. It's not just this sort of wow, isn't it this great metaphysical paradox that eternity is in time, but primarily what is going on is that the good, the moral requirement, is embodied and fully realized in time. So I don't know if that answers the question at all.
It's on the way.
It's yeah.
Well, I'm afraid we're out of time for our official session, but certainly conversations could continue afterwards. Would you join me once again in thanking Anthony Rudd?